Hello everyone, this is Hannah from Revision Dojo, and today we're going to be looking at syllabus point A1.1.4. This is the adhesion of water to materials that are polar or charged and the impacts for organisms. Okay, so let's get an understanding of what this term adhesion means. So, as water molecules also stick to other substances, this aids in a process known as capillary action, and this helps water move through plant vessels. So, water can pass through the pores in the structure of the soil. So I want you guys to imagine just a dry bit of soil. So this is initially going to be dry, and if we either water the soil or if it rains, this becomes wet with that water. And as it does, it is going to be drawn through the roots to be transported for the vessels. And also this water maintains not only the wetness of the soil, but also the wetness of the structures. And then when water evaporates, another portion of water can then be also absorbed to wet this part of the plant that has evaporated up through the plant. And this keeps the moisture of the structure, providing a life medium. Okay, so let's look at a few of these definitions in a bit more detail. So we have looked at adhesion. Now, let's also look at what polar means. Let's look at what an ion is, and let's also differentiate between a cation and an anion. Okay, so as we mentioned, adhesion is essentially the ability of water to stick to other molecules so it can be useful for transport. Now, a polar molecule is essentially, this arises from when there is an unequal sharing of electrons between atoms in a molecule. Now, a classic example of this is our water. Water molecules are polar molecules. We also have glucose molecules. This is another classic example of a polar molecule, where there is an unequal sharing of electrons between atoms and the molecule. Okay. Now, these polar molecules, they result in a slightly negative or a slightly positive charge. We define that as delta negative or delta positive. Now, let's look at what an ion is. Now, an ion is essentially when electrons either leave an atom or join an atom. Now, with an ion, we're not going to have this partially negative or partially positive charge. We're going to have a completely negative or a completely positive charge. Which brings us on to our next point, which is cations and anions. Now, these are pretty much interconnected, both of these with the ions, because a cation is a positively charged ion, and an anion is a negatively charged ion. So what happens with a cation is electrons leave the atom, so we have loss of electrons resulting in an overall positive charge, and then with an anion, we have electrons going to that atom. So we have an overall negative charge. Okay. Now, let's look at the impact of adhesion for organisms. So, as I was mentioning before, there is a process known as capillary action. So let's look at this process in a bit more detail. Capillary action. So capillary action is essentially the movement of water through a narrow space, and this is often in opposition to external forces like gravity. So I want you guys to think about the trees and the plants that you see outside on a daily basis. Now, these trees and plants, they could not thrive without capillary action, because capillary action is what helps bring water into the roots with the help of adhesion and cohesion. Water and dissolved ions, they can move all the way down from the roots all the way up to the leaves and the branches. And you can imagine that this is essential for water to travel to the organisms, especially our plants and trees, because without this water, they would not be able to survive.